Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 14, Water and Major Minerals. We are going to finish up the major minerals starting with sodium. So you've probably heard of sodium, you probably call it salt. The salt that we use in our food supply is technically sodium chloride, and it contains 40% sodium and 60% chloride. A lot of people believe that if they don't add salt to their foods, their salt can't be that bad, but in fact, the vast majority, 75 to 80% of our salt intake is from processed foods that we don't add any extra salt to. You might be surprised that sodium is a nutrient, an essential nutrient. We actually do have a need for it that varies by age. Um, it actually, as we get older, we need less of it. So anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 milligrams is what's needed in terms of salt. The reason why I have UL in red here, the upper limit in terms of toxicity, which is 2,300 milligrams, is because this is by far and away the more common problem. In other words, we tend to get plenty of salt in our diet. Our problem is that we get too much, and most of us easily consume more than the UL every day, which is a public health problem that we'll get to here in a minute. This is a nice table from your textbook that just lets you think about where the salt is coming from. So a couple important things about this. Sometimes, things that don't really taste salty or seem salty to us have sodium in it. I don't think anyone thinks milk is something that has salt in it, but it does in fact have a bit, 100 milligrams. And then if you look at the worst offenders, cheese, especially the more processed it is, contains a large amount of salt. Processed meats like beef jerky, ham, bacon is extremely salty, over 2,000 milligrams in just 3 ounces. There's a difference, vegetables don't generally have salt, but you might add salt when you cook. Canned vegetables tend to be higher in salt unless you make an effort to get the low sodium one. Grain products you might not think of as salty, but there is salt in things like bread and pasta, and of course chips and crackers, where a lot of times you can see the salt on top of them to give them their flavor, can be extremely salty as well. In terms of absorption, we talked a little bit about this. So active transport, again, is something that requires that protein carrier to get it in and out of cells. Active means that it requires ATP, and this again is happening in the both small and large intestine with the sodium potassium pump. That's just because sodium is so important in helping us maintain fluid balance that the body maintains the amount of sodium in our body very carefully. The major organ that controls excretion is the kidneys, of course, and we talked quite a bit about that at the beginning of this lecture. Here's why we need sodium, why it's essential. We actually use it to help absorb glucose and some amino acids in the small intestine. It's essential for normal muscle and nerve function. One of the muscles that needs normal electrolyte balance is the heart. And of course, it's very important in maintaining water balance throughout the body. Having said all that, deficiency is rare because it is so common in our food supply, especially here in the United States, where we tend to eat quite a bit of processed food, and it's a very common way to flavor and preserve food. Going over the UL of 2,300 milligrams is far, far more common. And while I rarely make you memorize numbers, I am kind of a stickler about this UL for sodium, just because I really want people to be aware of it and hopefully try to eat a little bit less salt if they're over consuming. The reason why we have a UL, what is sodium toxicity? It's not something that happens after a day of eating a lot of salt, but it is very much tied into chronic disease. So especially diseases related to the heart, like hypertension, heart disease itself, and stroke, those are all linked to having a high sodium diet. We also know that when you consume a lot of sodium, it causes you to urinate more and you lose more calcium, which is bad for your bone health. A little bit more about blood pressure, which is very much linked to sodium. Blood pressure, we can easily measure. It's the force that blood exerts on the walls of the arteries. So you test it with a blood pressure cuff and it's measuring that force. We express it as two numbers. Systolic is the amount of pressure when your heart is actively beating. Diastolic is that rest period in between heartbeats. So the systolic, the top number is going to be greater than the bottom number, right? It's more pressure when it's pumping and less when it's resting. So ideally, everyone's numbers is less than 120 over 80. If either one of those numbers is too high, that is a problem. If you're over um, If you're over that number, you can have anything from pre-hypertension to full-blown hypertension. That number has actually changed a little bit how we define pre-hypertension and hypertension, but know that 120 over 80 is normal, and anything above that we would start to worry. So I'm thinking here of causes, risk factors, and treatments. So a lot of things cause hypertension, and that's going to be very, if you're thinking about who's at risk for that, is linked to some of the causes. Some of it's genetic, just like most of our chronic diseases, but a lot of hypertension does have to do with lifestyle factors. So thinking about smoking, thinking about diet, we certainly know a lot of sodium, but it also can be a lack of some other nutrients. But too much sodium is certainly a risk factor. Overweight or obesity is also a really important risk factor for hypertension. So not surprisingly, given some of our habits in this country, we have quite a bit of hypertension. Um, Treatments, there's a lot of. Hypertension is fortunately one of those diseases that we can do a lot about. Not only are there lifestyle modifications to both prevent and treat, I'll give you a good example of that in a second. It's called the DASH diet. We also have lots and lots and lots of drugs that doctors can prescribe to help lower blood pressure. So here's the lifestyle modification, and this has been really heavily researched. I mean, they know now if you do these things, what impact it's going to have on your blood pressure. So if you lose weight, your blood pressure will go down 5 to 20 points for every 10 kilograms that you've lost. The DASH diet is something, it stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It's a very famous diet. It's been around a long time. It's very well researched. It's high in fruits, vegetables. It includes low-fat dairy, low saturated fat. So it's a very healthy overall diet. And it's been shown in many studies to lower your blood pressure by anywhere from 8 to 14 units. Being physically active, another 4 to 9. Keeping your sodium intake below that UL, another 2 to 8, and limiting your alcohol, so drinking moderately and not above moderate. And these are alone. So if you did a combination of these things, you could lower your blood pressure even more. A little bit more detail about the DASH diet, and you can look online. There's all kinds of free resources about it. If you kind of think about what you know about the breakdown, this is about what you know. This fits into the AMDR for the recommendation for all of these nutrients. It's a bit more of a, I guess, kind of higher carb-ish diet, keeping that saturated fat low and the cholesterol low. And then there's going to be this important emphasis on low sodium, high potassium, high magnesium, high calcium, and high fiber. So getting all those good whole grains and fruits and vegetables and not having a lot of processed foods. Another thing I always like to point out is to get the magnesium, which is hard for a lot of people. Eating nuts every day is, or at least a couple times a week, is a good way to do that. Here's how the dash plays out in terms of servings of foods and the food groups. Again, it's going to be a lot of whole grains, tons of fruits and vegetables. If you add this up, it's 8 to 10 servings a day. Making sure you get those dairy products. It's not going to be lots and lots of meat, more of plant-based sources of protein, and still having some treats once in a while, but certainly limiting them. So just to kind of quickly think about sodium, who's most likely to go over the UL? This, of course, is not the correct answer. Fruit is not high in salt. Diet soda can have salt, but not a lot. Cheese is the worst offender on this list, so this would be the correct answer, a person who loves cheese. So kind of the exact opposite of sodium is potassium. In terms of food sources, beans, you could add lentils and legumes to the list, potato, dairy products, fruits, vegetables. Potassium is a wonderful mineral. The problem with potassium is we need a lot of it. It's a major mineral, not a trace. The AI is 4,700 milligrams for adults, and most of us don't get anywhere near this. We need potassium. It's an intercellular cation. It functions very similar to sodium, but it helps decrease calcium excretion, whereas sodium increases it. If we develop a true deficiency, a dangerous deficiency would be something called hypokalemia, which is low blood potassium. That can actually lead to an irregular heartbeat, which is very dangerous. Very few people are going to develop true hypokalemia. For most of us, our potassium's, on the low side for many, many years, it's going to increase our risk of hypertension. So if you combine that, too much salt with too little potassium, that's a horrible situation for high blood pressure or hypertension. If you go over the UL, you can actually have too much blood build up of potassium, which is also very dangerous, and that's going to interfere with your kidney function. That back down. I just didn't want to block it in case you were taking notes here. There we go. So here's our potassium sources. I like to show this because when I talk about potassium, usually everyone just says banana. Bananas are not the only source of potassium. They're actually not even the best source of potassium. Where's the banana on here? There it is. So one banana only gives you about 10% of your total needs for the day. So you'd have to eat, 9 more bananas. You really need a variety of foods to meet your potassium recommendation. Beans, lentils, legumes, they'd all fall into that family, is actually the best source. And if you remember, beans were also good for fiber and a lot of our vitamins that we talked about. So really a great healthy food. Potatoes, which often get a bad rap because they're starchy and have carbohydrates, are an excellent source of potassium. A lot easier to get your needs that way than with a banana, I would even point out. And we're not showing all the fruits and vegetables, but the more you eat, the more likely you are to meet your potassium recommendation. So kind of staying within the same family, the next thing we'll talk about is chloride. Chloride you never really think of as being a mineral, but it is. It's in fact the other part of salt. So sodium chloride is salt. We need about 2,300 milligrams. This is based on the fact that salt is 40% sodium and 60% chloride. It is essential because it's an anion, a negative charge that helps maintain fluid balance. We also need it to transmit nerve impulses, and it's a part of hydrochloric acid, that important acid that is in our stomach. Because we have a lot of sodium chloride in our diet, deficiency is very rare. There is a UL, so we don't want to go too overboard with our chloride as well. Calcium's a bit more interesting. Most people have heard of it. Most people know that it's in dairy products. We also fortify foods like orange juice and sometimes breakfast cereals with calcium, and we can get quite a bit from green leafy vegetables as well. Most of us need somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 milligrams a day, but on average in the United States, we tend to fall short of that. Um, we have a UL for calcium. A lot of times people don't think of having too much being bad, but it is a mineral. It can start to build up and calcify on our organs and start to form stones. So you don't want to go over 2,500 milligrams a day. Who tends to get too much calcium? This can happen if you've got a parathyroid problem. I also might see it in people who take too many supplements. And especially sometimes the chewy ones, people eat them more like candy, and their calcium can be too high. This slide is supposed to be telling us a little bit about bioavailability. That's what these numbers are referring to. So all of these foods have calcium in it, but because of some of the other parts of the food, the calcium might not be very bioavailable, meaning that we're not absorbing it very well. So spinach, a nice leafy green, and rhubarb has good calcium, but because of the oxalates in those foods, we only absorb about 5% of the calcium. We can also get calcium from almonds, seeds, and beans, canned fish because you eat the bones, but we absorb about 20 to 30% of it. Most people will say dairy products when we talk about calcium. Again, we're only absorbing about 30% of it. Other greens, cabbage, mustard greens, and turnip greens, we absorb very well. Those are great ways to get calcium. And other vegetables also, we absorb the calcium very well. Calcium supplements will come in two major forms: calcium carbonate, which is the more common, calcium citrate, which is a little less common, mostly because it's a bit more expensive. You might want to spring for the more expensive kind, especially if you have certain problems. So who should take which? Calcium carbonate, you need acidity in your stomach to absorb it very well. And not everybody has that. Like an older person might not have as much stomach acid. People who've had any type of like intestinal or stomach surgery, including weight loss surgery, might not absorb calcium carbonate very well. When you take either one of these supplements is also somewhat important. Calcium citrate you can often sort of take whenever, whereas calcium carbonate you want to take on an empty stomach. How much should you take? Your body can only absorb so much calcium at a time, so you only want to take about 300 milligrams. If you're taking more than that, you're going to have to start to spread it out. So it's kind of a word of warning. Calcium supplements tend to be a little bit more complex when you start thinking about all of these things. Calcium is also impacted by zinc, iron, and magnesium, other minerals. So if you take calcium with those, especially if you had like a multivitamin that had all of them, the calcium is not going to be very well absorbed. Contamination is referring to the fact that sometimes competing for absorption is a good thing. Calcium helps prevent you from absorbing lead, and we don't want to absorb lead. Lead is actually toxic. But if you had poor calcium status, you would actually absorb that lead more, which of course would be a bad thing. So a little bit more about calcium absorption. We absorb it better. It's more efficient in the upper small intestine. It's a little bit more acidic because it's coming right after the stomach. Other things that influence absorption, oh, excuse me, the food source. So we talked about, whether it comes from dairy or certain vegetables will impact it. We also need vitamin D, that fat-soluble vitamin, to properly absorb calcium. If we don't have good vitamin D, we won't absorb it as well, which can cause problems. Efficiency increases during times of need. So if your intake is low and your body is kind of deficient in it, you will absorb it better. Whether or not you have a full stomach, most calcium forms are absorbed better on an empty stomach. Um, Age, we don't absorb calcium as well as we get older, and lots of things interfere with calcium absorption. So all of these things will make it more difficult to absorb the calcium. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about calcium is that we don't take blood tests. So calcium is in our blood and we can measure it, but it's not reflective of the calcium in our diet. And that is because our blood calcium levels are kept under very tight control. So this is sort of the physiological process that keeps our blood calcium between 8.5 and 10.8, which is the normal range. So say here, this person just had a lot of calcium. Maybe they had a big glass of milk and took their calcium supplement, and so that was absorbed and the calcium in their blood was high. The body's going to react to that. So the thyroid is that gland in your neck. It's going to sense that high blood calcium and release a hormone called calcitron, and that calcitron is going to decrease calcium release from bones. So if you're not leaching that calcium out of your bones, your blood calcium's going to not go up as high. It's also going to cause more calcium excretion in your kidneys. So trying to get that level down, right? Don't take any from the bones and pee some of it out in order to get back down into the normal range. The other end of the spectrum, say you're not a big calcium consumer, you don't take any supplements, your blood calcium levels start to get too low, your body doesn't like that either. And this would probably be the more common problem in the United States because we don't tend to meet our calcium needs. So what happens there? Now we have a new gland, the parathyroid gland. And that's going to release a very important hormone called parathyroid hormone. And that parathyroid hormone does three different things. First thing, it's going to stimulate calcium release from the bones. So because your bones sort of hold on to calcium, it's actually part of its structure, you can get calcium from your bones. Now, that's probably you recognize not being a good thing, right? Because you're going to decrease your bone density, and that can lead to something like osteoporosis. The other thing that's going to happen is that your intestines are going to increase calcium uptake, meaning that you're going to absorb calcium better. And lastly, we're going to have that effect on the kidneys. So we're going to retain calcium. We're going to hold the calcium in the kidneys and not excrete it out. This one right here, the calcium absorption is the step that's closely linked to vitamin D, why you need vitamin D for calcium absorption. So which of these increases calcium absorption? It's not this one because you can only absorb so much calcium. So if you take a calcium supplement with more calcium in the milk, that's actually going to decrease absorption. Calcium supplements with salty foods is bad because the salt is going to cause you to urinate out more of the calcium. You're going to lose it. Taking calcium on an empty stomach, that one really depends on which supplement, so it's kind of a tricky one. This one is a definite yes, though. If you spread your calcium intake out throughout the day, you will absorb it better than if you do it all at once. You probably knew that calcium is important for bone health. Now, I'm not going to get into a ton of detail here. Just appreciate that your bones are not just these big solid masses. Bones are actually incredibly cool. If you kind of blow it up, look at it like what would look under a microscope, it's actually quite porous. There's spaces. That's where our bone marrow and blood vessels are. If you look at it even more and you think about the different sort of cells that are in the bone, we have these specialized cells. So osteoblasts and osteoclasts kind of work opposite. Osteoblasts are these special cells in bones that actually help build your bone. That's how most people remember it. The B stands for build. Osteoblast. Osteoclasts are the cells that are active when the bone is actually sort of breaking down, dissolving, which would what would happen if you needed calcium from your bone for your blood calcium levels. An osteocyte's just a special type of bone in your, or a special type of cell in your bone. So these two, as in particular, are kind of working to sort of constantly break down and build up bone over the course of our lifetime. You probably didn't know this. Another important function of calcium is in nerve transmission. Hopefully you kind of remember this when you studied the nervous system and anatomy and physiology. You've got your nerves traveling through your nervous system. They're going to get to the end and form these synapses and be able to travel with neurotransmitters onto the target cell for carrying those neurological messengers. Calcium, with the help of calcium channels, is going to help in this process that gets the message through the neurotransmitter so they can travel. Osteoporosis is a bone disease that we typically see in older adults, especially women, and it is because of bone loss. So if you've got normal to low bone mass, sort of like pre-osteoporosis, we call that osteopenia. If you've got very low bone mass, you officially have osteoporosis, and your bones will break very easily. We tend to diagnose this with a DEXA. So if you remember DEXA, we also can use that to measure fat mass, but it's very good at measuring bone mass as well. Um, Prevention and treatment. So osteoporosis is a preventable disease. The problem is you have to start thinking about it at a very young age. So we think about bone building nutrients, of course, calcium, but also vitamin D, vitamin K, possibly potassium and magnesium. There's actually a lot of nutrients that are good for our bone health. We want to exercise our bones, put a little pressure on them, doing walking and other things like that will keep them strong. And if you have osteoporosis or very close to it, there are certain drugs that you can take um, to try and preserve your bone mass as much as possible. This is kind of why it's tricky from a public health perspective. Um, if you look at this is the ideal, right? So if you think about a young person growing, building up their bone mass, we put on most of our bone mass. It actually peaks right around age 20, which is probably around what most of the people in this class are. And we kind of stay the same, but starting around age 50, when you're starting to get into menopause and the hormones change, we lose bone mass. And the problem is you have to do a good job here in order to prevent a disease that usually happens here. Now, I'm guessing there's not a whole lot of 20-year-olds who are really thinking about building up their bone mass because they don't want to get osteoporosis when they're 75 years old. But in fact, that's exactly what happens. You're not doing a good job here and nothing's happening, right? You're not getting osteoporosis yet. But when you fast forward all these years later, if you didn't build it up here, you're more likely to have the ramifications of that when you're older. Here's the risk factors for osteoporosis. It is genetic. It's one of the few diseases where being small and thin is actually a risk factor. A smaller body mass is putting less pressure on those bones, so they are going to be weaker over time. Not getting good bone mass when you're younger, age, people who are Caucasian and Asian, especially postmenopausal women, are more at risk. People who experience amenorrhea, so if you stop getting your periods, which we usually see in um, athletes, female athletes, if you've had to have your ovaries removed, if you're a smoker, if you have poor dietary habits around calcium and D, you don't exercise, you drink too much, you have any of these diseases listed here, if you take some medications, especially steroids for autoimmune or other inflammatory diseases. So this is, again, I don't usually read long lists like that, but I find that there's always a few people in class, usually females, who have quite a few of these risk factors. And again, it's really something that you have to address now when you're younger. Um, is much better than waiting until it gets really bad and there's not as much as you can do about it. All right, next is phosphorus. Phosphorus is in all kinds of foods, so not only milk and cheese, but also meat, bakery products, and cereal. Because of that, we tend to meet our needs very easily. We also absorb it very easily, both active transport and diffusion, so it's not really a problem nutrient in our country. We need it. It's actually part of both of our bones and our teeth. It's part of, um, it's an intercellular anion. It's part of ATP and DNA. It's part of cell membranes and other cellular message systems. So it's important, but again, we tend to get a lot of it, so we don't tend to see deficiencies. Deficiencies are actually really rare. If you do have one, it's bad. It's going to cause bone loss and impact growth and tooth development, but we don't tend to see it very often. So babies that are preterm or born too early, they might not have built up enough storage before they were born. Alcoholics who just don't eat a lot, um, diarrhea, overuse of aluminum containing antacids, which are going to bind up that phosphorus. There is a UL, but it would be pretty rare. We actually don't put phosphorus in our supplements, so it'd be pretty rare to get high blood phosphorus. Magnesium is an interesting mineral. It's been popular lately. People are quite interested in it. It's in quite a few foods, but it tends to be sort of healthy, non-processed foods, which isn't always a strength of ours. Fruits, vegetables, nuts are a great source. We actually get magnesium in our coffee, but not a lot. Milk and meats. The average person gets about 80% of the way to the RDA, so most of us are just a little bit lower than we need it. It's absorbed fairly easily, and it does depend on intake. So if you're low, you'll absorb it better. And sort of like sodium, it's regulated by our kidneys. So we need it. It's really important for quite a few different biochemical and physiological processes. It helps bind ATP, so need it for energy. It helps with getting sodium out of cells and potassium in. It's used for normal DNA and RNA synthesis. We need it for normal muscle contraction. And there's a lot of interest in magnesium for insulin and specifically for diabetes and blood pressure. So it's like potassium. Having good magnesium is good. It helps keep our blood pressure normal and prevent hypertension. So we don't tend to see true deficiencies. If you're, losing a lot because of you're losing a lot of fluids, urinating a lot, or have some other type of gastrointestinal problem, you might get a deficiency. A true deficiency is very dangerous. Irregular heartbeat, weakness, muscle spasms can also increase your risk of osteoporosis. Um, there is a UL, but it's not from food, it's from supplements and non-food items. So some antacids and laxatives contain magnesium that we can have too much of. People who don't eliminate magnesium through their urine because they have kidney problems can cause buildup of magnesium, and that is incredibly dangerous. It can even cause a coma or death. So we want our magnesium to be just right, right? Not too low and not too high. We're getting here towards the end. Sulfur's kind of a weird one. We don't even have an AI or a UL for it. Um, we don't really tend to eat a lot of sulfur, but sulfur is part of some of our amino acids, which is where we get it in our food supply. We do have some things in our body that need sulfur. Again, we get it from those amino acids, help stabilize the structure of a protein and participate in acid-base balance. But for the most part, we don't tend to worry about too little or too much, so it's not one we talk about very often. So having said all of that, again, I always like to end these lectures with the tables in your book that summarize everything for you. So very important to kind of take notes and know where to find these on the exam and have a good sense of um, whether or not it's a trace or major mineral. We did major minerals in this lecture, functions, dietary sources, deficiencies, and toxicities. So thank you for your attention, and we'll move on to the trace minerals next.